I bought the house because of the river. It curved gently along the edge of our neighborhood like a silver ribbon weaving through the cottonwoods and dogwoods, whispering its age in the language of flowing water. There was a peace to it, something ancient and steady. I'd seen plenty of rivers during my time in the Army Corps of Engineers, raging ones, shallow ones, polluted ones. But this one, this quiet artery of life that curled past my backyard, was different. It reminded me of the creeks back home in Tennessee, where I used to build dams out of sticks and stones barefoot and covered in summer sweat. But this river didn't need makeshift dams. Someone long before any of us moved in had already done that. The old dam sat at the bend, a thick structure of stone and iron, rooted into the earth like the spine of the land itself. It was built in the early 1900s, maybe earlier, by farmers trying to slow erosion and hold back floodwaters during the storm-heavy seasons. The HOA deed records called it non-operational, but anyone who lived on Riverbend Drive knew better. It worked. It had always worked. The river rose during spring, but it never surged, never spilled. That dam was why our homes existed at all. I'd lived on Riverbend for 15 years. Retired after 28 years in the military, most of them engineering deployments and logistics coordination. I had picked this place because it was quiet, dependable. Like me. I didn't want flashy. I didn't need prestige. Just a place where the earth wouldn't shift under my feet. Where I could raise chickens, tend tomatoes, and fall asleep to crickets and the rustle of water sliding past the reeds. My neighbors were good people, retirees, teachers, a few working families. We waved at each other, traded jam, argued once in a while about parking or lawn heights, sure, but never over anything that lingered past Sunday. That started to change 2 years ago. The new families moved in young, ambitious, expensive cars and Bluetooth speakers in the yards. With them came complaints about the aesthetic of the neighborhood. The HOA board elections came and went like a summer storm, quiet and sudden. I didn't vote. I should have. The old board, Edith Michael, Mrs. Tran, stepped down without much fuss. They'd served for years and were ready to be done. The new board took over like a wrecking ball in a china shop. The president was a woman named Callie Dorsey. 40-something Pilates-toned, lived in the largest house on the ridge. She ran her campaign on modernizing the community. Her husband was some kind of regional real estate guy. I didn't know much except he wore mirrored sunglasses at all times and had a way of talking like everything he touched turned to gold. Callie and her board quickly made changes. Some were harmless new signage, digital newsletters, and HOA website. Others weren't. They banned backyard clotheslines. They regulated the types of mulch allowed. Then they turned their gaze on the river. I first heard about their vision plan during a community meeting in the clubhouse. Callie stood at the front with a projector showing renderings of open river vistas and improved waterfront appeal. I stared at the slides in disbelief. The dam was gone in all of them. Just blue sky, open water, and dotted lines for kayak launches and a community river walk. Wait, I said, raising a hand. Are you planning to remove the dam? Callie smiled like I'd asked if she liked puppies. We're considering all possibilities, she said. The current structure is an eyesore. It limits our waterfront potential. I've spoken with a few landscape architects who think the removal would enhance property values significantly. Several of the new residents nodded. Some even clapped. I didn't. I looked around the room and found only a few familiar faces. From the old days, Mrs. Klinger, whose garden backed right onto the floodplain. Mr. Dawson, who'd once spent an entire week sandbagging that exact area after a particularly bad winter melt nearly overran his basement. I stood up. With all due respect, that dam keeps the river in check, I said. I used to build them for a living. You remove that thing without a hydrological study, and you're opening the door for flood damage, real serious damage. Callie smiled again, but this time it had edges. Well, thank you for your input, she said smoothly, but I think you're overestimating the risk. The dam isn't even listed on the county's flood protection registry. It's obsolete. It's not obsolete if it's doing its job, I snapped. Her eyes flicked just for a second toward someone on her board. Her friend, Brianna, I think. They exchanged a look. The meeting moved on. I sat down furious. Later that week, I walked the riverbank alone, boots sinking into the mossy earth. The dam stood as it always had. Solid wet with the mist of runoff covered in ivy, but strong beneath it. I ran my hand along the rough stone and wondered if the next storm would be its last. Over the following weeks, I wrote emails, sent copies of the original Civil Works reports from the city archives. I submitted photos, diagrams, a detailed risk analysis. I even offered to bring in a friend of mine, an actual floodplain engineer, for a free consultation. I received no response. Nothing but a single note taped to my door. HOA members are discouraged from interfering in board-sanctioned development projects. Repeated disruptions may result in formal action. I kept that note. I didn't know then that I would need it for the city lawsuit to come, but I felt it in my gut. The river, steady as it was, had seen too many changes too fast, and the storm was coming. It's strange how quickly a neighborhood can change, not just physically, but in spirit. Before the new HOA took over, we had what I'd call a working peace. Sure, some folks mowed their lawns once a week while others let wildflowers bloom, but no one cared enough to cause trouble. The board existed, yes, but it mostly handled mailboxes and potluck reminders. They were retirees who volunteered because no one else wanted the job. But when the new crowd moved in within the span of a year, maybe two, it felt like a slow invasion dressed in athleisure. The first wave were folks like the Dorseys, the Glens, the Coles. Dual-income families with spotless SUVs, kids in private school, and drone-shot real estate listings. They had money, ambition, and ideas. I noticed it first in the way the conversation changed at HOA meetings. Suddenly, everything was about curb appeal and future development. Words like heritage and ecology got replaced with ROI and value projection. They didn't see the neighborhood as a living, breathing place. They saw a brand that needed refreshing. Callie Dorsey was elected president that spring, and from the moment she took the mic at the first HOA meeting, it was clear we were heading into stormier waters. She was charismatic, I'll give her that. Smooth talker, always smiling, always referencing studies or industry professionals, as if she'd personally consulted half of Forbes magazine. She had slideshows branding mock-ups, slogans, Riverbend where waters meet progress, like she was pitching a tech startup instead of managing fences and trash schedules. I want to bring Riverbend into the future, she said during her first speech, arms wide, as if she could hold the whole neighborhood in her grasp. We are sitting on untapped potential, and the river is our crown jewel. But it's being hidden behind a rotting slab of stone. That was her first public attack on the dam. I raised my hand and said, "That slab of stone is what keeps your house from floating into mine when the rains come." She didn't acknowledge me. From then on, the meetings felt more like theater. Most of the older residents stopped attending altogether. They said it wasn't worth the stress, that the new board was going to do whatever it wanted anyway. And they weren't wrong. The new board passed amendments with breakneck speed. They rewrote landscaping guidelines, banned raised vegetable beds, and issued citations to a 74-year-old man for using beige paint instead of approved warm sandstone. The warning letters came in glossy envelopes, now with branded letterheads and QR codes. I kept watching their moves carefully, especially anything that mentioned the river. One day in July, an announcement landed in every mailbox. HOA Exploratory Survey, Riverfront Beautification Project. The language was vague, but the images said plenty. Bright renderings of open lawns, lounge chairs, paddleboard docks. In every single image, the dam was gone, replaced with manicured gravel slopes and shiny retaining walls. I felt my stomach twist. That night, I walked down to the dam again. I took photos this time, close-ups of the structure, the waterline, the erosion patterns, everything I could think of. I made notes, drew diagrams. I started a folder on my desktop called HOA Recklessness. The next week, I showed up to the meeting with a folder in hand. There weren't many of us there, just 7 residents besides the board. Most were Callie's circle. A couple of us were holdouts, survivors. When the floor opened for discussion, I stood. I want it on record that removing the dam without professional environmental and hydrological assessment poses a serious risk to community safety, I said. Callie leaned back in her chair, hands folded like a high school principal tolerating a rambunctious student. "Mr. Carson, the dam is decorative. It's not on any critical infrastructure list." "Because it predates the registry," I replied. "That doesn't make it useless. It means it's old and it's worked for 100 years. Brianna Callie's VP chimed in, "But it's not pretty." There were some chuckles. I looked around the room, heart beating in my ears. "You can laugh," I said, But when you remove the only structure holding that river in check and the storms hit, you'll wish you'd listened. Silence followed, brief, brittle. Callie smiled that tight-lipped smile she'd perfected. Thank you for your concern. We'll take it under advisement. They didn't. Weeks later, a truck marked Jackson Creek Landscaping and Aquatic Design pulled up near the dam. I saw the crew surveying the area. I approached one of the workers, a young guy in a vest with a clipboard. You guys demoing the dam? He nodded. Yeah, some HOA project. They said it's just a bunch of old rock. I walked straight back home and started calling. I reached out to the HOA, the city's floodplain management office, even an old colleague from my Army days who now worked with FEMA. Most of the calls went nowhere. The city clerk told me the HOA hadn't submitted any permits for waterway modification, which meant they were either bypassing the process or planning to act before anyone could intervene. I sent another formal letter, this time with copies of my engineering credentials, floodplain mapping overlays, and annotated risk zones for every property downstream of the dam. No reply. But 2 days later, I got an email from the HOA legal liaison. Mr. Carson, we respectfully ask that you refrain from interfering with HOA-approved projects. Continued attempts to contact vendors or spread misinformation may result in legal action for defamation or obstruction. I didn't reply. I just printed the email and added it to the folder. They'd made their position clear, and I could feel the countdown ticking. One summer storm was all it would take. They didn't just ignore warnings, they erased them. The first time I warned them, I was polite. I wrote an email addressed to the entire HOA board, carefully formatted, filled with citations, and a clear subject line, urgent risk assessment regarding dam removal. I attached historical floodplain maps, aerial photos showing the waterline after storms in 2009 and 2014, and an engineering breakdown of what the dam actually did, not just visually, but structurally, environmentally, and defensively. It was the kind of thing I would have handed to a commanding officer in Afghanistan when planning a base on unstable terrain. I clicked send and I waited. 2 days passed. Then a reply. Not from Callie, not from the board, not even from a person. Just an auto response. Thank you for your message. This mailbox is not monitored. Please direct all questions to the HOA comment portal at www.riverbendcommunity.org. The portal, right. I went there, submitted the same information through their community feedback form, which gave me 500 characters to explain why they were putting lives and homes at risk. I squeezed what I could. When I clicked submit, it returned a cheery message. Thanks for helping make Riverbend better. That was warning one. The second time, I stood on the riverbank with Brianna, the board's VP, while she directed a crew with survey equipment. It was early morning. I'd walked out with coffee, saw the vans, and decided enough was enough. Brianna, I called. She turned sunglasses, catching the light. Oh, hello, Mr. Carson. Do you realize that dam slows stormwater flow by at least 35% during peak rain? You take it down and the floodplain triples. She raised an eyebrow. That dam isn't even on any municipal record. That doesn't mean it's not working, I snapped. It was built before digital permits. It's grandfathered in. She crossed her arms. Our contractor says it's just decorative. Then your contractor is a landscaper, not a hydrologist. She turned her back to me. We're following the board-approved plan. You'll receive updates through the proper channels. I didn't receive any, so I escalated. I called the County Water Management Division and filed a formal complaint. I referenced the Clean Water Act, Section 404, and reminded them that any removal of stream obstructions could constitute illegal waterway modification without U.S. Army Corps of Engineers approval. They took down my info, promised to look into it, and that was the end of that for a while. I also tried the Department of Environmental Protection. A kind-sounding woman answered, listened to everything, then sighed. Unfortunately, if the structure isn't classified as critical infrastructure, we can't intervene without a triggering event or complaint from a municipality. So I tried the city planning department. There I got lucky. A guy named Miguel knew what a pre-1960s civil barrier looked like and agreed to meet me on site. He came on a Wednesday morning wearing a city-issued vest and work boots. I showed him everything. The erosion patterns, the water line stains on the stone, the makeshift barriers residents had tried placing downstream decades ago before the dam was reinforced. He took notes, snapped photos, measured. "You're right," he finally said, tapping the stone with his clipboard. "This isn't decorative. This is functionally active. If they tear this out, there's a real chance you flood downstream during a 2-year storm." I nearly hugged him. He promised to file a report and send a warning letter to the HOA within the week. But it didn't matter, because 2 days later, the dam was gone. No notice, no email, no signs posted. I woke to the sound of heavy equipment ripping, groaning, crushing. I ran down to the river barefoot and half-dressed to find a backhoe halfway into the stone wall, its arms swinging like a wrecking ball through time. Chunks of rock lay scattered along the bank. The ivy that once draped the stone like a curtain of history now dangled in shredded strands. The water ran muddy and fast, gurgling over the broken remnants, as if startled by its own freedom. I yelled at the workers, "Who authorized this?" One shrugged. "HOA did. We're just following plans." I took pictures, hundreds, of the rubble, the equipment, the water flow. I even took a selfie with the dam ruins behind me and time-stamped it. Evidence. That night, I went back to the portal. This time, I didn't hold back. You've removed an active flood control structure without a permit or professional evaluation. If one home floods, one garden washes out, one child gets swept away because of your negligence, I will personally see that every one of you is held accountable. This isn't over. I didn't get a reply. Instead, a few days later, I received a cease and desist letter signed by an attorney on behalf of the HOA. "Mr. Carson, this communication constitutes formal notice to cease all defamatory claims against the Riverbend HOA and its board. Any further attempts to intimidate, obstruct, or threaten legal action may result in litigation for harassment and reputational damages." They weren't just ignoring me now. They were trying to shut me up. I could have backed off. A younger me might have. But I'd seen what ignorance and arrogance could do in the field. Entire villages gone because someone thought they knew better than the land. And now it wasn't just theory, it was real. The dam was gone. The river had one less leash. And the clouds were starting to gather. It didn't happen with ceremony. There was no ribbon cutting, no town announcement, no community celebration. One day, the dam was there, as it had been for over 100 years, and the next morning it was a gaping wound in the riverbank. They came at dawn like thieves. I was up early, as I often was feeding the hens and sipping my black coffee on the back porch. The cool air carried the faint mechanical hum of diesel engines before I saw anything. My ears perked like a dog's. That sound didn't belong in the quiet hush of the river morning. I followed it. Boots still muddy, coffee still in hand, I walked toward the trail that led down past my property and behind the line of hedges that curved with the river's bend. And then I saw them trucks, 2 flatbeds, a backhoe. Men in orange vests unloading steel ramps and heavy machinery, their voices loud against the stillness. And in the middle of it all, standing on the bank with her perfectly coiffed hair and a clipboard in hand, was Callie Dorsey. "What the hell is this?" I shouted as I broke through the trees. Callie turned slowly, as if she'd expected me. "Mr. Carson," she said with a strained smile, "you shouldn't be on site. This is a restricted work zone." "You're tearing it down," I said, stunned. "No notice, no final vote, no permit on record." She looked back at the backhoe, which was already rolling toward the edge of the dam like a mechanical predator. We held a closed session. It passed unanimously. The board is empowered to act on behalf of aesthetic improvements and safety. "Aesthetic improvements," I echoed. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" The operator lowered the steel claw into the top layer of stone. It screamed as it scraped through. "You're digging your own graves," I muttered. Callie crossed her arms. "This structure is not recognized by the city, nor is it listed as flood infrastructure. It's unsightly. We have plans for a clean, natural riverfront trail." I took a long breath. "Natural, you're altering the hydrology of the entire floodplain." She tilted her head. "You'll see. It'll raise property values." Then the first chunk came loose. A slab of stone, thick and heavy, was lifted from its century-old resting place and dropped like garbage on the riverbank. The dam groaned like something alive, old bones cracking. I walked home in silence, furious, hopeless. By that afternoon, half the structure was gone. By dusk, the entire barrier had been reduced to scattered stones and a wide-open channel where the river surged free uncontained. I watched it from the trail near my yard. The water moved faster now, louder. It didn't glide anymore, it rushed. And downstream where the land dipped, and the soil softened, the first signs of erosion began. Within days, tufts of grass were pulled from the banks, the reeds thinned. One morning, I found a chunk of earth 6 feet wide, gone from the far side of the bend, like the river had taken a bite. I documented everything. Each day I returned to the site with my camera and notebook. I logged water speed flow changes, displacement zones. I emailed it to the city, to the State Water Commission, to every agency I could think of. No one replied. The HOA didn't respond either. They celebrated instead. I saw Callie post photos on the community Facebook group, people walking by the river, children skipping stones, the caption reading, "Welcome to a brighter, freer riverbend." I didn't comment, but I kept the screenshots. Then came the rain. Not all at once, not biblical, at least not yet. Just heavy summer storms, the kind that crept in at night and drummed the rooftops like warning knuckles. The first came 3 days after the dam was demolished. It rained for 6 hours straight. The river rose higher than I'd seen it in years quickly. By dawn, the path behind my property was submerged. Half my garden fencing had disappeared underwater. The current ran fast and angry. Mrs. Klinger's dog disappeared that night. He'd wandered near the bank, as he always did. She called out for him in the dark, flashlight trembling in her hand. The next morning, his collar was found wrapped around a branch downstream. I attended the next HOA meeting in person. The room was full, tense and wet. Most of us had walked through puddles just to get there. I waited patiently until they opened the floor. Last week, I began calmly. You removed the only structure controlling the river's rise during storm events. That's not speculation. That's fact. Since then, erosion has increased and water levels are rising faster. How much longer before someone loses their home? Callie looked tired but not remorseful. We've received no official notice of danger from city or state agencies, she said. I nodded slowly. So you'll wait until FEMA shows up. There was a stir in the room. A few neighbors, older ones, the ones who remembered the river's moods, nodded in agreement. Others sat silent, watching Callie. She tried to smile. This is a period of adjustment. The river needs time to settle into its new course. It's not a child adapting to a new school, I snapped. It's a body of water that doesn't care about your vision boards. A beat passed. Then she said something that chilled me. We'll monitor the situation. But frankly, Mr. Carson, fear-mongering doesn't help this community. Fear-mongering. That was the word she used. Like I was a conspiracy theorist peddling paranoia. I left the meeting shaking, angry. Not just because of what she said, but because I knew she'd already made up her mind. The board wasn't going to admit to a mistake. No one ever wants to be the one who broke something sacred. But that dam had been our shield, a quiet guardian. And now it lay in broken pieces, and the river had no leash. I knew what was coming. I'd seen it before. And this time, there would be no sandbags, no soldiers, no choppers bringing supplies. Just families in pajamas standing in ankle-deep water, asking why no one saw it coming. It started with a silence that didn't feel natural. You learn after enough years in flood zones that water doesn't arrive all at once. It creeps. It announces itself if you know how to listen. The birds quiet. The wind gets heavy. The air thickens like it's carrying a warning. That's how it began that Sunday morning. I was outside patching the southern fence line where the ground had started sloughing away, a subtle landslide brought on by the river's increasingly aggressive edge. What used to be gentle lapping had become a slow gnawing pull, soil-slipping root systems exposed like fraying nerves. As I hammered in a new post, I noticed the sky. It had the wrong kind of gray, flat, colorless, stretched too wide across the horizon, like someone had pulled a tarp of steel wool over the town. I checked the radar on my phone. A swirling mass. They were calling it stationary. That's the worst kind. A storm that comes, parks itself above you, and forgets how to leave. I felt it in my chest tight like before a firefight. I gathered my tools and went inside. The rain began around 11 a.m., just a whisper at first, a sprinkle on the windows. But by noon it was falling in sheets, dense and urgent. From my back door, I watched the river swell. It wasn't rising so much as surging, pushing against itself, brown and foam, tipped, impatient. Without the dam, there was nothing to slow its acceleration. The water, unfettered, slammed the outside bend of the riverbank. I could already see pieces of earth tumbling into the current, carried away like loose threads. By late afternoon, the neighborhood Facebook group exploded with posts. Does anyone else have flooding near the trail? My basement sump pump is already running non-stop. Backyard's underwater. What do we do? Callie posted once, stay calm. This is within normal range. The board is monitoring the situation. Normal range. I stared at her words like they were written in another language. By nightfall, it was clear we were past that point. I slipped on my rain gear and waded out with a flashlight heading toward the lowland stretch near Brianna's house. She lived on Riverside Loop, which curved along the inner bank, the side that used to be safe because of the dam's protection. Used to be. As I neared the bend, my beam caught the glitter of water moving across the walking path. Not just puddles floodwater seeping like blood through gauze, inching across the landscape. 2 houses had lights flickering. One had sandbags too few too late. Then I heard the groan. A tree uprooted by saturated soil tore free and collapsed into the river with a sound like a building falling. The wave it caused splashed up and over the bank, soaking my legs to the knee. That night I barely slept. The storm didn't move. The next morning, I stepped onto my porch and couldn't see the trail behind my yard. It was under at least a foot of moving water. The current had formed new tributaries, small violent fingers that crept between houses and under fences. I got a text from Mrs. Klinger. My shed's gone. Just floated away. An hour later, Brianna's husband Darren was pounding on my door. He was drenched, panting. "Do you have sandbags?" he shouted. "The backyard's caving in." I nodded and pointed to the garage. "Top shelf. Take what you need." He didn't thank me, just ran. At noon, the first basement flooded. By 2 p.m., the river had consumed 4 backyards. And by 5, the water reached the edge of Callie's patio. That was when everything changed. Suddenly, she wasn't posting about natural vistas or increased property values. She was silent. Neighbors began to gather physically, in boots and rain jackets, knocking on doors forming human chains, to place makeshift barriers with plywood trash bins, anything that might divert the flow. But the river didn't care. I stood at the edge of the rising water, watching a swing set get carried away like a toy. A trampoline flipped and twisted like a dead jellyfish in the current. One of the newer homes, just 2 years old, groaned. I saw the foundation crack on the north corner. The family had already evacuated, thank God. Minutes later, the corner dipped, and the porch collapsed into the flood. Still no help had come. No sirens, no city workers, nothing but us and the storm. That evening, I finally reached Miguel from the city planning office. He sounded breathless. "We're overwhelmed," he said. "The south sector's underwater. We have crews deploying pumps, but they're prioritizing assisted living centers first." "I told you," I said, voice sharp. "I told you this would happen." "I know," he said, and I put in the warning. But they overruled it. They said the HOA's demolition didn't require review. My heart sank. "Do you want me to forward your reports to the Emergency Operations Center?" he asked. "Yes," I said. "Forward everything. All of it. Photos, emails, timestamps. I want it all on the record." That night, I walked the neighborhood with my notebook in one hand and a flashlight in the other. I marked which homes had been hit worst, which basements were flooded, which residents had left. At Callie's house, the entire back patio had eroded. Water lapped at her sliding glass door. She stood behind it in the dark, her hands pressed to the glass, staring out like she'd seen a ghost. I didn't wave, didn't knock. She had built this with her own hands, one bad decision at a time. The next day, the National Weather Service issued a flash flood warning. But we didn't need one. We were already living it. The sound of water changes when it decides to take things. It's not the lazy bubbling you hear on a summer hike, not the soft lapping against a dock. When water turns violent, when it decides it no longer belongs inside its banks, it roars. It snarls like a living thing. And on the third night of the storm, that sound never stopped. By then, half of Riverbend had already evacuated. The city finally sent emergency crews, but they were too late. The sandbag lines were futile. The river had carved new paths through backyards under foundations across driveways. Some roads were impassable. My old pickup was wedged halfway in a ditch after I tried to reach the community center and slid sideways in the mud. I'd spent the night on my roof, sleeping in Shift's radio strapped to my vest, like it was 20 years ago, and I was back in Kandahar waiting for a dust storm to pass. Except this wasn't a war zone. It was my home. And the enemy wasn't some insurgent. It was the result of arrogance, negligence, and water set free. The next morning, I waded through knee-high muck to check on Mrs. Klinger. Her entire backyard was gone, swallowed by the river like a snack. Her swing bench was wedged in the branches of a tree 20 feet downstream. She stood in her kitchen, staring out the back window like her eyes were still trying to understand what they were seeing. "I lost the root cellar," she said softly. "My grandfather built that with his hands." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, then stepped outside and took another photo for my folder. The destruction was worse than I expected. 6 houses along Riverside Loop had structural damage. 2 had basements filled floor to ceiling with water. One, Brianna's, had its retaining wall collapse, taking her entire garden with it. The smell of mold and sewage already hung thick in the air. That day, the city sent drones. I watched them buzz overhead, documenting the damage. I made sure to wave my arms and point toward the bank where the dam used to be, where the stone had once broken the river's rage. But the river no longer respected the boundary it had followed for a century. Without the dam, it ran like an unbroken wild horse, fast, reckless, and unwilling to return to its stall. I checked my notes. Rain totals had already doubled what we usually saw in July, and the storm wasn't over. At the temporary shelter in the middle school gym, the mood was brittle. Neighbors huddled around cots and folding chairs, charging phones at overloaded outlets, watching the news on silent TVs, with subtitles that read "Unprecedented flooding in central districts. Riverbend neighborhood hardest hit." They didn't say why. I saw Callie there. She was curled up near the back, her yoga pants caked in mud hair in a wet knot, face pale. She looked nothing like the woman who once stood in front of us with her riverfront beautification slides and bold promises. She looked small, like someone who'd been caught pretending. Our eyes met. She looked away. Someone told me her house was condemned that morning. The floodwaters had warped the foundation, split the floorboards. Her insurance agent reportedly told her it would be complicated. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The water had already spoken louder than I ever could. That night, another tree fell near my property, an old pine that had held for decades. It toppled slowly, its roots exposed by the churning of the water and the softening of the earth. I watched it fall from my window, cracking as it collapsed into the river, swept away like driftwood. I didn't sleep. I went outside instead in the dark, wearing my headlamp and boots. I moved along the old path where the dam had been, where now only scattered stones remained, half submerged, half dragged away. I crouched beside them and ran my fingers across the surface, feeling moss, silt, and loss. I stood there for a long time. When morning came, I made a decision. I packed my evidence, every photo, every time-stamped email, every annotated report. I put it in a waterproof folder, wrapped it in plastic, and drove it straight to the emergency command post downtown. I told the officer at the desk I needed to speak to whoever was coordinating infrastructure response. They directed me to a room with clipboards, laptops, maps pinned to every wall. A woman named Tasha met me at the door. "I'm the FEMA liaison," she said. "What have you got?" I handed her the folder. She flipped it open, then she stopped. "Wait," she said. "You're the one who warned them." "Yes," I replied. She nodded, eyes hardening. "This changes everything." She sat me down. I explained the whole timeline. When the new board took over, how they bypassed permits, how they hired unlicensed contractors under the guise of aesthetic improvement. I showed her where the dam used to be, how the river's flow rate had changed, how the floodplain had expanded. She took notes the entire time. Then she said something I hadn't expected. "There's going to be an investigation, possibly even charges." I just nodded. When I left the command center, the clouds had finally started to break. Sunlight filtered through in weak patches, as if testing the air. Steam rose from the ground. The river, while still high, was receding slowly, reluctantly, like a guest who knew it had overstayed. But the damage was done. Dozens of homes destroyed, hundreds displaced, and all because someone wanted a prettier view. I drove home in silence. My truck rattled over potholes carved out by the flood, and as I passed Riverside Loop, I saw people dragging soaked furniture to the curb. Mattresses slumped in the mud like dying whales. Family albums spread open on the ground, photos curling in the heat. This wasn't just water. It was erasure. The river had taken everything that mattered. And now, finally, someone was listening. It didn't take them long to start pointing fingers. By the following week, as floodwaters receded and the news trucks rolled in, the HOA released its first public statement. Printed copies landed in water-stained mailboxes across Riverbend like sad little bandages over bullet wounds. The Riverbend HOA expresses its deep sympathy for all residents affected by the recent severe weather event. This unprecedented storm caused historic levels of flooding, impacting multiple regions of our state. The HOA board is working closely with local authorities and insurance partners to support recovery efforts. Nowhere in the statement was there mention of the dam. Nowhere did they acknowledge that it had been removed just days before the flooding began. Instead, they blamed nature, as though the rain had simply lost its mind and targeted us at random. As though the river had betrayed us out of spite. It made my blood boil. They tried to play it as an act of God washing their hands of responsibility, like Pilate at the basin. But God didn't hire the backhoe. God didn't send the contractor. And God sure as hell didn't ignore my warnings. They did. Still, some residents, especially the ones who had joined Callie's board, clung to the narrative. It was just bad luck, I overheard one woman say at the shelter. No one could have seen this coming. I almost laughed. Instead, I pulled out my phone and opened the folder I now carried with me everywhere. Screenshots, time-stamped emails, photos of the dam before and after. Callie's Facebook post bragging about liberating the river. My original letter to the city planning office dated weeks before the first storm. I didn't say anything then, but I was building something. The real meeting came a few days later, an emergency community forum organized by city officials held at the high school auditorium since our community center was still drying out. Hundreds showed up. Most looked like I felt tired, hollow-eyed, angry. At the front of the stage sat a panel of officials, a representative from the city council, the mayor's assistant, someone from the state environmental agency, and 2 emergency management officers. Sitting awkwardly off to the side, looking like children told to apologize, were Callie, Brianna, and the remaining HOA board members. The mayor's assistant opened the meeting. "We're here tonight to understand what went wrong," he said, "to determine what steps were taken and whether any actions taken by the HOA board contributed to the impact of the flood." Callie immediately stood, a prepared statement in hand. "We followed every guideline available to us," she said, her voice tight but controlled. "There was no indication that the structure we removed, the former dam, was essential to flood control. It was deteriorating unsightly and posed a risk to riverbank erosion." I stood. "Permission to speak?" I asked. The moderator nodded. "Go ahead." I walked to the front, folder in hand. My boots were still muddy. I hadn't shaved in 3 days. I wasn't there to impress. "My name is Tom Carson. I'm a retired Army Corps engineer. I lived on Riverbend for 15 years. I warned this board verbally and in writing that removing the dam without a hydrological survey would destabilize the floodplain. I held up a stack of printed emails. This is documentation of every warning I issued. Dates, attachments, expert assessments. You'll find correspondence with city officials and photos showing erosion patterns that began within days of the dam's removal." I moved to the projector and connected my tablet. A map appeared, a before and after of the neighborhood. In one image, the old dam held firm, the river calm. In the next, a surge of water poured through where the barrier once stood, flooding yards, home streets. Gasps rippled through the room. "This wasn't an act of God," I continued. "This was an act of negligence," Callie interjected. With all due respect, I cut in, my voice rising. "You made a unilateral decision to alter the watershed. You prioritized aesthetics over safety. You ignored expert advice, dismissed residents, and now half this community is sleeping on gym mats because of your choices." Silence. Even the city officials said nothing at first. Then the environmental agent, a woman named Serena Nguyen, cleared her throat. "We've reviewed Mr. Carson's submissions and conducted our own independent analysis. Preliminary findings suggest that the removal of the structure significantly increased downstream flow velocity, contributing to the severity of the flooding." Translation: the dam mattered. The room erupted, some in murmurs, some in outrage. Several residents stood to speak. Mr. Dawson, whose garage was swept away. A young couple whose nursery had been underwater by the time they got home from work. One by one, they told stories not of rain, but of a system that had failed them, of leaders who had looked at an ancient, functional piece of infrastructure and seen only an eyesore, who chose appearances over protection. The city promised an investigation. The state opened a probe into whether the HOA had violated environmental regulations by not securing proper permits. And then came the class action talk. Someone stood and announced that a law firm was taking statements. Another passed around a clipboard. People signed without hesitation. Callie sat frozen lips pressed, tight eyes darting. I watched her for a long moment. She looked up and met my gaze. There was no apology in her expression, just fear. The kind of fear that comes when you realize the thing you built to prove your power has now turned on you. And then it rained again. Not much, just a drizzle. But I think for the first time she truly felt what it meant. To be powerless. To be exposed. To realize the river remembers. And it keeps score. They didn't expect me to be organized. They'd spent months brushing me off, treating me like the stubborn old man with too much time on his hands and too many opinions about rocks and rivers. But when the water receded and the truth came to the surface, I didn't just have accusations. I had receipts. The investigation escalated quickly after the community forum. The city launched an official inquiry. FEMA sent a damage assessment team. State environmental regulators began reviewing Riverbend's HOA filings. And suddenly the same board members who once strutted around with clipboards and landscaping plans were nowhere to be found. But I was easy to find. They came to me. The city's legal counsel reached out first. A woman named Karen York, sharp-eyed and meticulous, knocked on my door with a folder in her hand and a tape recorder in the other. "Mr. Carson," she said, "we've heard you kept records." I didn't answer. I just pointed to the kitchen table where 4 binders sat neatly stacked beside a USB drive. She flipped through the first one. "Holy hell," she muttered under her breath. "You kept everything." "I built field command bases in Iraq with less documentation than I've got on this mess," I replied. Over the next 3 hours, I walked her through everything. Email I sent on June 3rd, warning the board of potential floodplain destabilization. The HOA's official response, dismissing my concerns. The site photos taken before and after the demolition. The screenshots of Callie's social media posts calling the dam an ugly relic. The cease and desist letter threatening legal action if I kept interfering. The timeline I had drafted, every weather alert, every board decision, every structural change laid out alongside rainfall totals and river gauge readings. The copy of the FEMA Infrastructure Impact Manual with highlighted passages proving that the dam, while old, qualified as a functional barrier requiring federal notification before alteration. Karen sat silently for most of it, her pen moving quickly. At the end, she leaned back and said, "I think this might be the most thorough community documentation I've ever seen." I shrugged. No one listens to the guy yelling in the wind unless he's holding a map and a compass. Later that week, the local news ran a segment, Riverbend HOA under investigation for dam removal preceding historic flooding. I watched it from my living room lights, dim audio low. They showed a side-by-side photo, one of the dam in spring sunlight, ivy creeping across the stones, birds perched at the edge. The next, a barren riverbend stripped of its bones, water churning where stability had once lived. They quoted me briefly. It wasn't an act of nature, it was an act of negligence. I didn't like hearing my own voice on TV. It felt too loud, too final. But the neighbors noticed. Over the following days, I started getting knocks at my door, not reporters, but residents. Some I barely knew. A man from 2 streets over brought me coffee. A woman named Lita, who had once avoided me at HOA meetings, left a pie on my porch with a note, "Thank you for speaking up when the rest of us stayed quiet." They were finally waking up, but I wasn't done. At the next emergency HOA assembly, this time called by the city, not the board, I showed up with my laptop, 2 printed reports, and a projector. The gymnasium was packed. Some of the walls were still stained from where water had breached the seams. Bleach hung heavy in the air. Folding chairs creaked beneath tired bodies. The mood was electric, simmering with long-buried frustration. The city's legal team took the floor first, outlining the violations. Failure to obtain demolition permits. Unapproved modification of a waterway. Neglect of environmental impact assessments. Suppression of dissent from residents with technical expertise. Then they turned to me. I wasn't on the agenda, but when the moderator asked if there were any final comments, a dozen people pointed my way. So I stood. I walked slowly to the projector, plugged in the USB, and waited as the screen flickered to life. No music, no dramatics, just a simple slideshow I titled, "The Cost of Ignoring Warnings." I walked through it slide by slide. Slide 1, the dam intact in March. Slide 2 rainfall data from the last 5 years, nothing unusual. Slide 3 email excerpts from me to the board, ignored or rebuffed. Slide 4 damage photos, Callie's collapsed patio. Darren's flooded garage, Mrs. Klinger's eroded backyard. Slide 5 FEMA floodplain maps before and after the dam removal. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Each slide was a nail, and by the time I reached the last, there wasn't a sound in the room except the low hum of the projector fan. I ended with one sentence. We didn't need new views. We needed protection. Callie sat in the second row, flanked by what was left of her board. She didn't speak. Her eyes were red. Whether from anger or shame, I didn't know. But I knew this, whatever story she'd told herself about beautifying the neighborhood, it had died with the dam. After the meeting, the city announced that the HOA board was under review. A third-party administrator would be temporarily appointed. Legal proceedings were being prepared, and lawsuits plural were expected within the month. I didn't celebrate. I went home and sat on my porch watching the river settle into its new shape. It still moved too fast. It still cut too close. But at least now someone was watching. And this time someone would listen. Justice didn't arrive with sirens or headlines. It came in thick manila envelopes, in clipped signatures on official paper, in the weary methodical shuffle of consequences finally catching up to arrogance. The first lawsuit was filed less than a month after the flood. A class action claim backed by 32 Riverbend homeowners, including some who had once voted for Callie's board. Their names were scrawled across affidavits recounting property damage, displacement, financial loss, and mental trauma. Some had lost everything: photos, heirlooms, the walls where their children marked birthdays, in pencil. But the case didn't stop there. City investigators uncovered a chain of damning details. Ironic, really, how fitting the word damning became. The HOA had bypassed multiple city ordinances. They'd failed to submit demolition plans to the Environmental Review Board. They hadn't notified state water authorities. They hadn't even secured proper insurance for structural modifications. Worst of all, they had knowingly ignored warnings from a qualified expert, myself, and then attempted to silence that expert with legal threats. That was the big one. Negligence was one thing. But documented willful ignorance, that stuck. Callie and her board were served personally, no more hiding behind digital newsletters or passive-aggressive portal posts. Brianna cried when the papers hit her front door. Darren packed their things into a U-Haul a week later. The HOA board was formally dissolved under emergency provision by the city. In its place, a temporary receiver was appointed, an older woman named Lucinda White, formerly a municipal mediator for neighborhood disputes. She didn't smile much, and she didn't take sides. But she did show up in person to every meeting, clipboard in hand, listening to the residents one by one. I was among the first she asked to consult. We sat across from each other in the library's back meeting room, the air still smelling of flood-dried carpet and paperbacks. "I read your report," she said without preamble. "Impressive work." "Would have been more impressive if someone had read them before the flood," I said. She didn't smile, but I saw a flicker of respect. "We're rebuilding," she said, "but it won't be quick." I nodded. Nothing worth doing ever is. We met weekly for months. We walked the riverbank together, noting areas too dangerous for development, mapping out temporary reinforcements, flagging storm drains clogged with debris. I wasn't on the board. I wouldn't take that job if you paid me, but I was something better. Trusted. The city worked fast once liability was established. Federal aid came through after FEMA's report corroborated the evidence in my files. Grants were awarded to help families rebuild, to reinforce new retaining walls, and most importantly, to fund the construction of a new dam. This time, it wouldn't be hidden in ivy and memory. It would be modern, monitored, respected. The engineering firm they brought in consulted with me directly. It was a strange feeling to sit at a table with blueprints again, to hold a laser pointer instead of a hammer. But the knowledge was still there somewhere, beneath the anger. Together we designed something the river couldn't ignore. They broke ground in late October. It rained the next day, of course, as if the sky had to test us again. But the sediment held. The new foundation withstood it. And for the first time in months, the water didn't rise. Meanwhile, the legal battle against the former board played out slowly, like most things in the justice system. But it played out in full view. Depositions, interviews, public disclosures. The court ordered Callie and 2 other board members to pay restitution to the HOA for misuse of funds. Others were barred from serving on any homeowners board in the state for 10 years. Callie's real estate license was suspended. Her house sold at a loss. The foundation repairs had eaten through any resale value. I never saw her again. But sometimes, I imagined her somewhere else telling herself a new story. One where she was the victim, where she had meant well, where the river had betrayed her, not the other way around. That's the problem with people like her. They believe the view is the thing that matters. But the land has its own memory. The water has its own will. And if you treat them like decoration, they will remind you that they've been here far longer than your 2-car garage and HOA bylaws. They reminded all of us. And in that reminder, we changed. The neighbors that once kept their heads down now spoke up at meetings. We created a volunteer committee not to replace the board, but to support it, hold it accountable. The bylaws were rewritten with transparency and consent requirements. No more closed sessions. No more secret plans. I helped draft those changes. In a sense, the flood had washed away more than fences and furniture. It had torn through complacency. It had broken the old patterns. And from that mud, something stronger had begun to grow. Still, I walk the river every morning. Old habit, old need. The new dam stands proud now, its concrete gleaming flanked by native plants, and a quiet steel sign that reads, Riverbend Flood Control Structure, Reconstructed 2025, dedicated to community resilience. They wanted to put my name on it. I said no. Let the river keep its mystery. Let the story belong to all of us. Because we earned it. The hard way. It took a year before the river stopped feeling like a threat. For months after the last hearing, even after the new temporary dam was in place, I found myself waking at 3 a.m. at the sound of rain. My boots stayed near the door. I kept a flashlight charged even when the sky was clear. It wasn't just me. Neighbors confessed to the same thing, that low-grade panic whenever water hit the gutters too hard. But recovery doesn't happen all at once. It creeps in slowly like spring after a brutal winter. We started with what we could control, clearing debris, cutting back overgrowth, hauling ruined furniture out to the curb. Then came the community meetings, this time led by Mr. Hahn, the city's appointed overseer, who brought calm professionalism and, more importantly, transparency. Every permit was posted online. Every decision came with a vote. Every resident had a voice. It was the first time many of us felt like Riverbend belonged to us again. The city approved funding to rebuild the dam, not a replica of the old one, but a modern, reinforced structure, designed in consultation with floodplain experts and environmental scientists. I was brought on as an unpaid advisor, which suited me fine. I didn't want a salary. I wanted to make sure no one ever made the same mistake again. We held town halls not just to discuss construction, but to educate. We invited hydrologists, engineers, historians. We learned about watersheds and riparian buffers, about erosion and retention basins. The more people learned, the more they cared. That was the real rebuild awareness. And slowly things began to grow again. Families returned. Homes were repaired, some rebuilt. The city added an emergency drainage channel along the southern edge, and new native plantings helped stabilize the banks. The river began to calm, not just in flow, but in presence. It was no longer a threat, just a reminder. A presence you didn't turn your back on. Callie moved away. I heard she sold her damaged property at a loss and relocated upstate. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile when the for sale sign came down. What would have been the point? She would carry the weight of her choices farther than I ever could have inflicted. Sometimes the best justice isn't punishment, it's memory. Brianna issued a private apology to the neighborhood by letter. I didn't respond. Others did. Some forgave. Some didn't. That was theirs to carry. As for me, I found healing in the work. Most mornings, I still walk the trail by the river, camera in hand. Not for documentation now, but for peace. The light off the water. The sound of current breaking gently against the new stone. The birds had returned. So had the foxes. The land, like us, had remembered how to live again. One day, in early May, we held a rededication ceremony. It wasn't fancy. Just some chairs in the grass, folding tables with lemonade and cookies. Kids ran barefoot near the edge of the bank, laughter ringing through the trees. At one point, Mr. Hahn stood up and gave a short speech. This dam is more than stone and concrete, he said. It's a promise that we will protect this place, not just from water, but from ignorance, from hubris, from silence. He paused, then looked toward me. And we owe that promise to the people who refused to be ignored. I stood, nodded, said nothing. It was enough. Later that afternoon, a boy no older than 10 ran up to me with a notepad. "Are you the guy who saved the town?" he asked. I shook my head. "I'm the guy who remembered what the river could do." He didn't quite understand, but he smiled anyway and ran off. I watched him disappear down the path, thinking how strange it is that water, something so simple, could carry so much destruction and yet so much renewal. The neighborhood would never be the same. But in some ways, that was the best thing that could have happened. The people who stayed were stronger, wiser, more connected. We had looked disaster in the face and chosen to rebuild not just with materials, but with intention. We planted a tree near the dam that day, an oak sapling rooted in soil that had once been underwater. We named it Remembrance, not to dwell on loss, but to honor the cost of forgetting. I passed by it the other day. It's already taller than my shoulder, leaves a bright green promise against the sky. And when the rain comes again, as it always will, I won't fear it. Because now we are ready. Now we remember. Now we rebuild.